heard you correctly, at 5, I should just go ahead and start.
Yeah, I believe so. So I believe that's, yep, here's Stephen.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Wes McNeese, and I'm the SIU System Executive Director for Diversity Initiatives. I want to welcome you to this 2-hour virtual session. This is our first in a series of what we're calling Conversations of Understanding, specifically for the Southern Illinois University community, and it's being sponsored by the SIU System President's Office and also the System's Diversity Advisory Council. I serve as convener for that council. Systemic racism will be the topic of discussion for this evening, and we pulled together a distinguished institutional panel made up of leaders from the institution and students. And they're going to give their personal impression of the topic, and then you will be invited to question and or make comments about what they have to say. Our 5 panelists are the system president, Dan Mahoney, the SIU Carbondale Chancellor, Austin Lane, the SIU Edwardsville Chancellor, Randy Pembroke, the SIU Carbondale Student Trustee, Stephen Gere, and an SIU Edwardsville Student Government Diversity Officer, Madeline McKenzie. Madeline is sitting in for SIU Edwardsville Student Trustee, Jacob Graham. This conversation will be moderated by Todd Bryson. He's the Chief Diversity Officer for SIU Carbondale. Lakeisha Butler, who's Director of Diversity and Inclusion, SIU Edwardsville School of Pharmacy, will be handling questions and comments from the virtual audience. She will take these and send them along to Mr. Bryson. And because this evening's topic has the potential to evoke deep emotions, we have asked 2 counselors to join us on this call. They are Jamie Clark, who's Director of Counseling and Psychological Services, SIU Carbondale, and also Courtney Bodie, the Chief Mental Officer, SIU Edwardsville. Carol Walker is the Zoom coordinator for this meeting. Now, we fully recognize that systemic, institutional, structural racism has several formal meanings. And for this evening, we have chosen the following definition. I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to know that this definition is also open to comment and discussion. Here it is. Biases pervading systems and institutions at all levels of society, detected in processes, attitudes, and behaviors which wittingly or unwittingly harm and disadvantage certain minoritized racial groups. That's our definition. Mr. Bryson, the program is now yours.
Todd, you're muted. You're muted right now. We need to have you.
I apologize for that, everybody. As Dr. McNeese indicated, my name is Todd Bryson, and I'm moderator for tonight's discussion. The topic of systematic racism is very important to us as a system, and it's too important to wait for us to be in a room together. We need to move forward with this discussion on race, justice, and equality now. More importantly, this gives everyone across the U.S., the SIU system and beyond, a chance to share our collective experiences and concerns to grow from them. We decided to use YouTube because it gives us the greatest opportunity to connect everyone from all three campuses and beyond in one large group that we wouldn't do using any other platforms. It also lets us record this conversation so that we can go back and listen again, as well as allow those who are not able to join us to listen at a future date. Just to remind everyone, we're going to have a question and answer format tonight to provide the maximum amount of time for discussion and feedback. We want to hear from you, so please submit your questions using chat. We will have an initial question for our panelists, and then we'll begin answering questions from the audience. As Dr. McNeese indicated, after the question and answer with our panelists, we will begin to wrap up by devoting some time for Dr. Jamie Clark, Director of Counseling and Psychology Service at SIU Carbondale, and Dr. Courtney Bodie, Director of Counseling Service at SIU Eversville, who will share their perspectives on noticing, experiencing, and utilizing our emotions during this tumultuous time. They will also share thoughts on how to engage in difficult dialogues in ways that support mental health while converting emotional expression into socially just action. Dr. Courtney Bodie will go first, followed by Dr. Jamie Clark. And finally, we will hear from President Mahoney, who will close out our discussion. With that in mind, we're going to start with our first question. Panelists, tell of a time when you encountered systemic racism in an education setting. How did this encounter make you feel? How did you react? What one thing would you like to see happen at SIU to address the systemic racism? We'll start with Dr. Mahoney.
Dan, you're muted.
All right, you hear me now? All right. Well, again, I want to thank Todd, thank all the panelists for joining us today, and thank all of you for being part of the conversation and how we can move forward. So first, let me make it clear. I have never been a victim of systemic racism. That should be clear by looking at me, but it's clear that is not something I experienced. So what I'm going to talk about more is what I have seen as opposed to what I have experienced myself. And I could provide a number of examples of systemic racism that I've seen in higher education, but I'm going to focus on one, the use of standardized tests, ACT and SAT, in the decisions that we make. Research has long indicated that they are biased, and they particularly have a disproportionate negative impact on students of color. And they're also not great predictors of college success. Still, most institutions rely very heavily on standardized test scores for making decisions about admissions and other decisions. In 2015, I became president of Winthrop University in South Carolina. Now, frankly, Winthrop had done better than most schools in recruiting, retaining, and graduating students of color. Still, like most institutions, it relied pretty heavily on test scores in making admissions decisions. So one of my first discussions with the Winthrop board is, should we be test optional? And I got a lot of pushback and a lot of concerns, and a lot of it was things I'd heard before at other places. You know, just because the national data indicates it doesn't predict success, what about here? We don't know what the case is here. GPAs nowadays are inflated, so that you can't really rely on them, and they vary so much between school to school. It would be a mistake to rely on GPAs too much in our admissions decisions. So to me, it seemed like we had a data discussion. So I examined the data myself. And what I found was, as I tried to predict college success, whether it was GPA, retention rates, I found that high school GPA predicted about 25% of the variance. SAT scores about 1%. So clearly, high school GPA was about a 25 times better predictor than SATs. So I took that to the board. They say, well, 1% was still statistically significant. So not sure we want to get rid of it based on, even though it's a small percentage. And then my analysis wasn't really overly sophisticated. So I took it to our math department. The math department did the work of analyzing the data with the students over a longer period of time, and really a more sophisticated analysis than I had done. And if anything, everything they found was consistent with what I saw. In fact, I think it was even clearer. So while the GPAs, high school GPAs may be inflated and they may vary across across high schools, they are still a much, much better predictor than SAT and ACT scores are. Still, there was no willingness to change. Now, admittedly, at this point, I'm pretty frustrated. And I believe many of the board members were frustrated with me because I keep bringing the issue up and they basically are telling me no. Although I will say there was never a vote. It was always just a long discussion about why it wasn't a good idea. Then a year ago, and this was at a public meeting with about 50 to 100 people there, the chair of the Winthrop Board of Trustees, who I should point out is African-American, said after we had a budget discussion that we needed more students who could pay the full tuition cost. And then he said, and this is an exact quote, "We need to recruit more white, Anglo, middle and upper middle class males. That is my definition of diversity." To be honest, I was shocked and stunned that anyone would say that in a public meeting with so many people there. I also believe it gave me insight into why I was struggling so much with this discussion of being test optional as an institution. Now, I should point out Winthrop did vote in April to go test optional, but it's only for this year and only because of the COVID crisis, and they plan to go back to the policy they had before. Now, what did I do? My first reaction actually was to reach out to some of my African-American and Latinx colleagues. I knew how I was impacted by what I heard, but I knew they must have felt differently than I did. And I wanted to be supportive and understand where they were at that point. And sure enough, they reflected on ways that were different than me. And it was also good for me to hear that. As I always say, whenever we're talking about issues of diversity and racism, I'm still learning. And I learned something in that situation as well. Now, over the days that went by after that, I reflected on what was said. And one of the many things that I thought was wrong was it was based on a false assumption that rich people will pay the full tuition because they can afford it. So again, I go back to the data. That's what I did. I looked at the data, and what I found was, as I looked at every possible demographic group you could, the group that paid the least amount of net tuition were upper class white males. In other words, what that means is we were discounting their tuition more than any other demographic group at the university. Why? It comes back to the SAT and ACT scores and the reliance on those on making decisions about scholarships. And I actually started to do my own little analysis with my own kids. So I have two kids, they're both pretty good students, but one has a higher SAT score and one has higher class rank and higher GPA. I started going to all the net price calculators for different institutions. And sure enough, guess who gets more scholarship dollars every single time? The student with the higher SAT scores. In fact, at one public university not too far from here, he would get $70,000 more than his sibling, just based on having higher SAT scores, even though the sibling has outperformed them at the same high school, taking pretty much the same curriculum. So when I think about systemic racism, I think this is a prime example of that. We're giving out scholarships based on something that we know is biased, we know is not a great predictor of college success, but yet we do it anyway. So as I think about what we need to do at SIU, is one of the things we need to do is look at our process and our how we're giving out scholarships and how we're determining merit aid, particularly. And looking at whether we're seeing the same type of problem that I saw at Winthrop University. And if we do, then we need to make some changes in that so that we have a more equitable distribution of the scholarship dollars we have. So that's my story. And I think it's a good example of systemic racism, particularly one that has an impact on all of our students.
Thank you, Chancellor, President Mahoney. Dr. Lane, would you like to go next?
Sure. And hopefully everyone can hear me. First and foremost, I just want to say good evening. Thank you for this opportunity. One of the things that comes to mind very quickly, based on what President Mahoney just mentioned, leaders who ignore race in higher education really perpetuate racial injustice. I think it's very clear by us having this venue today, we want to do something about it. I've not even officially started yet. I start on, I guess, coming up here in a couple of days. And I will tell you that I'm very proud to be a part of this system and this institution because we are talking about this. If I were to give you an example of systemic racism in higher education, I have several examples, but I'll give you one. This happened early on in my career in higher education, where I was trying to make my mark, but not really understanding the institutional culture that existed, which in most cases, when you look back now, was probably filled with some systemic racism. because it really regulated, it kept intact the history that was there. It held a lot of individuals, very talented individuals back who were performing very well, but just could never land that management position or that higher level position. That particular culture protected the power structure and the history. And it really worked against many of the minority faculty, staff, and students in their ability to be promoted if they were a faculty or a staff member, or to be admitted. And if there were a student, and you heard President Mahoney speak to the SAT and the ACT in that regard in terms of merit aid and even admissions. And so that was the story. And so I found myself early on having to advocate and somehow find data or information when it came to my job title and the compensation that I was given, because it never matched my counterparts or my colleagues who were in the same role and had the same level of education and experience. I could never figure out why they were being compensated more than I was. And at that time, the answer was always, well, it's just that way. It's just the way it is. And almost as if I should be happy about landing the job, but not having the compensation that followed it. And so it was clear that that particular system was set up and it didn't really work to my advantage. My biggest mistake, and this probably gets into what I probably should have done, but my biggest mistake is that I simply accepted that. And I basically chalked it up to the culture of the institution and overlooked the inequity. And I just attributed it again, just to this is how it is. It wasn't until I became president years later that I started to take a broad look at fair compensation and internal equity, and really to make sure that it was being addressed for others, since I had had such a tough time with it, but to try and make sure that at least it was being addressed in a fair way for others, and also creating opportunities for people of color and all staff members or faculty members who wanted to advance in their careers. And it was important for me to make sure that we had the appropriate pipeline, so to speak, to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to be promoted, or at least to have an opportunity to shine, where they could be promoted. And so for me, that was something that I said I had to do if I ever was put in a position where I was the leader of an institution. So as leaders, I think we have an obligation to act even in the face of adversity, even in the face of an institutional culture that has been there for a long time, that may have impacted really good individuals in trying to move forward. Any injustice that we see, I think it's our duty and obligation to call that out. And not just because of the things that have taken place over the last few weeks, but these are things that, when I think back to when I was in college, at least, there were a lot of emotional things that came out as well, with a lot of incidents at that time, whether it was Rodney King and some other things that caused a lot of us to be just as emotional about what was going on. And unfortunately, we're still dealing with some of that today. But I think as leaders, it's our job not to ignore it, or else we just perpetuate further that racial injustice.
Chancellor Thunberg, would like to go next.
Thank you. Let me begin by saying how much I appreciate President Mahoney, Dr. Bryson, Dr. McNeese, this opportunity to address issues tonight and to discuss these important topics. I've been at SIUE for almost 4 years now, And one of the things that I want to talk about as it relates to systemic racism has to do with a part of the undergraduate academic experience that is the bookend, the opposite end to what President Mahoney was talking about. He addressed the issue of scholarship and financial support on the front end of the experience. I want to talk about something that I've noticed as it relates to data at SIUE and other places, and it relates to retention and graduation. And so I'm going to share just a few numbers for you. I'm sure that many of our listeners, people who are participating, know these numbers, but it speaks to something that bothers me greatly. And there is something called the 6-year graduation rate. So from the time a student starts 6 years later, what percentage of that cohort that started has graduated? And if you look at the national figures, the overall 6-year graduation rate is about 63%. So roughly 63% of those individuals who start 6 years later have an undergraduate degree in hand. So overall 63% 6-year graduation rate. The 6-year graduation rate for Black students is 42% nationally. So 21% below the overall figure. At SIUE, when we look at our peers, the overall graduation rate, 6-year graduation rate is 57%. For Blacks, it's 38%. At SIUE, and this is a number that I'm not proud of, it's a number that we've been thinking about and working on. The SIUE 6-year graduation rate is 50%, and the 6-year graduation rate for Blacks is 28% at our institution. So you look at that, it's 22% below our overall number. Now, the reason why I bring these numbers up is because I think higher education, I think universities are in the business of helping people reach their career goals, to get to the finish line, to be able to attain a degree so that they can accomplish the goals that they have in mind, that they can have the careers that they are pursuing. And so I see numbers like that, and it bothers me tremendously. So what do we do about this? One of the things that you have to do to keep people in the pipeline to graduate on the 6-year timeline is to have a retention from freshmen to sophomores that keeps them on the path toward graduation. So one of the things that we've been talking a lot about at SIUE is our freshman to sophomore retention rate. We have raised the retention rate about 5 points during the time I've been here. But I'm pleased to say that we've raised the freshman to sophomore retention level for Black students 10% during that time. So that's the good news. The bad news is that it's still 10% below our overall freshman to sophomore retention rate. So we continue to take a look at things to try to address that. We have tried to implement intrusive advising, people like Dr. Patterson working in SOAR. We've created first semester transition courses. We have implemented peer-led teaching. We have reinstituted a summer success bridge program. We have also created a sustained dialogue program so that students can talk about their experiences at SIUE. And a couple of years ago, we started the Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion. All of these things are important. They are helping. They are putting us on a better path. But as I said, we're still not there yet. So we're considering additional programs such as the RISE program, which specifically is for Black male students at SIUE. It's a cohort model so students can go through together, take classes together, and build relationships that hopefully will help students be retained. We're also doing more with equity advising within all of our programs. And one of the things that we're considering is a program that we call SCORE, which has to do with experiential learning, particularly in the STEM fields. So I think if you look at the retention figures, the graduation figures, it indicates that something is not right in higher education. And we have to have the courage to acknowledge that and to pursue programs that will address those figures so that there is more equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Pembroke. I am being told that my sound is very bad, so I hope you all can hear me a little bit better right now. We're going to go to Maddie, SIU student. Do you have anything you would like to answer this question?
Yes, I would, Todd. So I prepared a little statement so I didn't forget anything. But so I want to just acknowledge being a lighter complexion biracial woman. I wanted to discuss how I've been affected personally by systemic racism, but I also wanted to talk about how I unfortunately benefited from it in certain situations. So when I transferred to SIUE from Lewis and Clark Community College, I noticed there wasn't many people that looked like me. The students, faculty, and staff were all predominantly white. And for the first time in my college career, I didn't feel like I belonged on campus or that I was really even supposed to be there. Over time, things did improve. But after doing research about our institution, I did find out that we are a predominantly white institution. 74% of our population is made up of white students. But on the other hand, I just want to acknowledge how I benefited from the system. So like I said, I'm kind of a lighter complexion biracial woman, but I've been able to, because of that, I've been able to occupy predominantly white spaces in academia because of my lighter complexion. And there are several reasons why, but I just wanted to acknowledge the historical context of colorism in schools. So historically, it was common for schools to have preference for the admission of light-skinned African-American students over dark-toned African-Americans, regardless of their academic abilities. And colorism was, and arguably is still today, used as a tool of oppression by denying equal educational access and career opportunities based on skin tone within a community of people of the same racial background. And historically, judgments were made to determine the value of individuals of color and their level of intelligence. And I had some solutions to how we can combat systemic racism. So Dr. Mahoney, or Dan Mahoney, was talking about scholarships. And so I was thinking we could recruit students of more diverse populations. And that can even start when we look at recruiting from high schools, looking at not just predominantly white high schools that we're going to and saying to, come to SIUE or Carbondale. And also offering like scholarships for not just the STEM related fields, but also like specifically the fine arts and social sciences, political sciences that a lot of African Americans dominate in. And then additionally, I think that both freshmen and transfer students should have to undergo mandatory classes in either race and ethnic relations or something equivalent to that. Because we're not having these types of conversations. So I think it's really important that we make it mandatory. I know at SIUE, I don't know about Carbondale, but I could assume that it's the same. We have to do training called Not Anymore on sexual harassment and rape and stuff like that. I think that we should have something equivalent to that on, discrimination and race and ethnic relations. So those are some of the solutions that I have in mind for combating systemic racism. Thank you.
Maddie, thank you so much. Mr. Gere, would you like to go next?
Yes, good evening, everybody. Thanks for this opportunity. I'll be honest and say that I personally haven't dealt with systematic racism, at least knowingly. Because I did well on ACT scores. I mean, I was a good student, so I really didn't have to go through any other resources. I knew what was available for me. I kind of knew my career track when I came to college. So I kind of had myself set up. But speaking to a lot of exploratory students that come in through the exploratory program that have low ACT scores, they say that the advisement that they're given is poor. They're kind of put in this group like, okay, we didn't do well on the ACT scores, so they're not going to graduate, or they're not going to be, may take them 6 years or longer to graduate. So they're kind of looked over. And when you're a freshman coming here, especially in the exploratory student, you need a lot of guidance. And if those advisors aren't guiding them the way that they should, versus telling them to go undeclared and kind of leaving them off to fend for themselves, it should be more strategic and should be more of a plan of action to make sure that the students are in their right field and that they are getting the resources needed. Because even if they do have a low ACT scores, if we're recruiting them, what are we going to do to keep them here? How are we going to help them? How are we going to make sure that they're successful at this institution? So, and then there's resources available to students of color or minorities, but they don't have the resources. So making those resources more available to them, so that way they know their options, they know their opportunities, they'll feel a little bit more satisfied versus, if they don't feel that they're getting what they need. I hear a lot of students say that they don't feel like SIU is catering to them. A lot of African-American students caters to them. So for them to come back as a sophomore or junior, it kind of dwindles because they don't have the support from the university. So, so yeah, that's my little tidbit. So of course, and a lot of the students that come in through the exploratory program come from, backgrounds, maybe poverty stricken, letting them know that, hey, there may be some funds available to help you with your tuition. Tuition is worrying about paying tuition is a burden. So helping these students relieve a lot of burden so they can focus more on school versus trying to get in the next semester. But yeah, that's pretty much where I'm coming from as far as catering more to those students with those low scores or who struggle in their program, specifically marginalized or people of color, so that way they can be more successful.
Thank you, Stephen. We're going to start taking questions from the audience. Our first question, and I'll let Chancellor Lane start off with this, and then whoever wants to follow up Chancellor Lane, you can just jump right in. The first question says, as a person with racial privilege, what steps can I take to ensure that I am part of the solution versus a part of the problem of systemic racism?
Well, I think it's what I mentioned earlier that, if we are in these leadership positions and we just ignore what's going on, then we're really wasting space and wasting time, and we're definitely not going to be able to help get to the justice that we're looking for. So I think it's incumbent upon leaders in higher education to have these discussions and then go right into action. You heard already from many of the folks on this call, more action steps in terms of what can we do collectively to really ensure that this is not something that was just a fad or was just a popular movement where we were able to post things or talk about it, but have real action that moves us in the direction where we can sustain the progress that hopefully we're making today. And so it's really going to come down to how well we do that and how well we break down some of those barriers that exist. I think the title of this event, Conversations of Understanding, is very appropriate because we're not assuming that we know everything. And we really are trying to find out, what is it that we can do individually, what can we do collectively to make sure that we're all better together.
Who would like to go next?
I can go next, I think. One of the things I would say is, as a person with privilege, I think is first recognizing that. And I think recognizing in a way that is not defensive. I think sometimes when people hear the term white privilege, it's, I don't deserve to be where I was. And people start to get into this, I worked hard and all of these things, and they take it very personally. I think some of it is being open to the fact that you have had some advantages. When I walk into a room for an interview, people view me differently because of the color of my skin, and there's been advantages to that. And often I'm interviewing, I think Maddie said it well when she talked about, going in to see faculty and most of them are white. Well, when I was interviewing for positions, I'm in front of a mostly white crowd. And there are some benefits to that because they're more likely to see me as somebody that they can connect with and that have similar experiences. And so first is understanding that that is a reality. I think the second thing is we unfortunately in higher education often put the burden on people of color to deal with the issues of systemic racism. And that's an undue burden on all of them. And that sometimes takes them away from all of the other things they also want to be working on. So I think it's taking on some of that burden too, of really looking at everything we do and thinking about, is this really a fair and equitable way of recruiting students, of distributing scholarships, of hiring, of promoting, of anything we do relative to retention? Are we really doing it in an equitable way? And part of that, I think, is also listening to people who, as some of our panelists have talked about, what their experiences are, what they're hearing from people, and really trying to find solutions when you hear it's not working well for this group of students, or the things aren't working well for this group of employees, being open to listening to that and trying to find solutions. I think that's the obligation that we have as leaders.
Thank you, President Mahoney. Chancellor Pembroke, would you like to go next?
I would encourage people to volunteer, to get involved in conversations, to think through the ways that they would like to see the world change. There's a popular saying that we should be the change we want to see in the world. And so I think if people want to take that passion that they have and find ways that they can make a difference in the world, that's a path that I would encourage. We have a task force right now on campus that's studying racism and racial issues, and I've been so encouraged by the number of people from various backgrounds that have become involved in that. So get involved is the first step, I would say.
Thank you, Chancellor Pembroke. Who would like to go next? Or we can go on to our next question. Go ahead, Maddie.
Okay, so I think it takes being actively anti-racist. I've seen a lot of my friends share information, especially about like the police brutality against Black, Indigenous people of color, and the recent killings of like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. I think it's important to continue to share information on social media. That's great. But also we need people out there protesting. We need to have hard conversations with family members that may not necessarily agree with, what we're talking about, and having conversations with friends and surrounding yourself with people that may not think the same as you, and like kind of diversifying your friend group. And I think that's what's going to get us, like just having these conversations, like us having the conversation of understanding and continually doing this is not something that's like a one and done thing. It's going to take people to constantly, keep advocating. And, and Black Lives Matter is not something that was just trendy on Facebook or Twitter for like a week. Like Black Lives Matter still matters today and will always matter. So I think it just takes people really actively wanting to change. And the good thing about being anti-racist is you can also evaluate yourself in ways in which that you may have been unconsciously biased in the past, or like your implicit biases. So, yeah.
Thank you very, very much. Stephen?
Yes, I was gonna piggyback off of Maddie was saying to make sure that we understand our own biases first, and then educate ourselves on what we can do to better. If we're going to advocate, we need to be more knowledgeable. We need to be consistent. So I would say, yeah, first, acknowledge what you don't know and be okay with that. Okay, that's my own bias. How can I work to be a better person to advocate for that population?
Thank you very, very much. Our next question is open to anybody who would like to respond first. Why would potential students want to go to an institution where they do not see individuals, faculty, who look like them? How will this issue regarding recruitment and hiring be addressed in the future?
Don't know who you want to start first. I can start, and then I'll turn it over to the chancellors and let them kind of discuss some of their plans. Yeah, we've done this at other places I have been. There is a lot. That is another example where there's a lot of biases in the process. We've done the same process for a long time. We haven't done a good job of recruiting diverse candidates, and our response is to keep doing the same process over and over again and thinking the results will somehow be different. They won't. We need to do some different things. We need to be much more aggressive in recruiting diverse faculty and staff. I often talk, when I talk with people about what they do, they say, well, we advertised on one of the diverse issues in higher education websites or something like that, and now we're done. That's not enough. It's got to be going to conferences, reaching out to people, making connections. Once it's up and running again, there's what's called the Institute for Teaching and Mentoring, which is the largest gathering of minority PhD students in the country. I've been recruiting there for 10 years. We will be recruiting there for faculty, and they're some of the most outstanding young faculty you'll find. So we need to be much more aggressive in what we're doing. And we need to, as we're going through the search process, every step, think about, is there bias in this? Is there bias in how we've written the ad? Is there something we're asking for that's going to be disproportionately true among certain people and not among other groups of people? As we're reviewing the applications, are we doing something that is eliminating candidates who would be qualified, but based on our own biases because they don't have the same experiences we did, they didn't go to the same type of institution, we've eliminated them as candidates. We need to have more people who we used to call them at Kent State diversity advocates, and Winthrop as well, diversity advocates on the search committees who are really trying to make sure we're kind of identifying that bias when it comes out. And so that we get a better pool of candidates, we give people more of a fair chance through the process. Winthrop, we went from 14% of our faculty and managerial staff being people of color when I got there to 21% in just over 2 years. And again, always hired the best people, but we changed the process and we changed how we did things, and that made the world of difference. So I think our commitment is to make that change going forward. So this will be a place that will better reflect the student body.
So
Thank you
I
very,
think
very much.
the question, Todd, was why would people go somewhere? Why would students choose to attend an institution? My discipline is music, and I will say that in my field, most of the time students choose to go to a place because they make a connection with a faculty member. And often students stay at a place because of the encouragement of faculty members. So the question that we're talking about here is very important as it relates to the diversity of our faculty. And I think that one of the things that we can do, in addition to what President Mahoney was talking about, is to encourage our search committees, to train our search committees so that they have knowledge of search processes, so that they are more committed and have better tools for finding a diverse pool of candidates. And so I think that another thing that we can do is to create incentives so that as the process unfolds, that we have the ability to bring a diverse set of candidates to the campus for interviews and to follow through and hopefully hire a wonderful candidate at the end. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Chancellor Pembroke.
I would just add that I think, and I would echo both points made by the president and Chancellor Pembroke. My thought is that it has to be part of the institutional culture. It goes back to what I was describing earlier in one of the first responses, is that we've got to make it part of our strategic plan. It has to be something that we are all agreeing that is a problem that we want to fix together. And that way it's not being on anyone. It's not being distributed out just to one area, not the other. We all have to agree that if this in fact is a problem, if our students are telling us this, if our faculty are telling us this, if the community is telling us this, then we need to be committed to putting that in a very detailed plan and then monitor it and actually check our progress, put some measures on it and find out if we're actually getting closer to the target. I think that is probably the approach that will at least keep us all accountable. It will keep us all focused on, as you heard Maddie mention, not just a social fad, but this actually will be something we put in practice and we monitor and that we encourage. And so I think you have to be able to do that. I attended an HBCU, and so about 98% of my faculty members were folks who look like me. And, and then when I went to graduate school, it was the exact opposite, right? And so it just flipped back and forth. And so I understand what students are saying when they want to have someone who may look like them to instruct. I think what we have to do is make sure, at least what my president told me then, it was going to be a different world when we left the HBCU, and that we were going to have times where faculty members were not going to look anything like us, and we were still able to make some connections there. And so I think that we have to work hard, again, putting it in our strategic plans, monitoring, being accountable to it, and then making sure our students, we prepare them for what the world will be when they get out.
Thank you, Chancellor Lane. I have a follow-up question to that, and anybody can answer this. And it's more like a statement, but it says, the focus should not just be on recruitment of faculty, but retention is essential. Faculty need to feel supported, respected, and valued. It's more of a statement. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that, but
I would totally agree. I think that's been, and I've been places that have done that very well, and I've been places that have done that frankly poorly at times. And creating an environment where people can be successful and feel supported. You're right. It's frankly not different than what Stephen was talking about with the students. If they feel that the support is there, that they're wanted, that the university is supporting them, it makes a world of difference in retaining people. When people are happy, and most of us hate moving. We only move when we're unhappy where we are, and so we have an obligation to try to make sure that we can do things to make it a place that they would like to stay and feel welcome and feel part of something special. And frankly, part of it's including them in discussions we're having and do things we're doing on campus so they feel part of the community. And I think that's one of our obligations when we recruit people, is I always say that's the first step. The next step are the things we have to do after that.
thank you.
If I could add something, Chancellor Lane talked about culture and how important it is to reflect your culture. One of the things that I think we don't talk enough about in higher education is, particularly for faculty, the promotion and tenure process. The promotion and tenure process is a set of values. So if you value scholarship, then you talk about scholarship within those promotion and tenure guidelines. If you value teaching, then you talk about teaching. If we value diversity and inclusion, then promotion and tenure has to address those values. And I think we don't often enough have those conversations about our expectations of faculty in being promoted and being tenured, how they are contributing to the diversity of our university and what we expect as it relates to that. Because when we make those kinds of statements and include those in P&T criteria, then it is a way to incentivize, if you would, people to address diversity issues. So yeah, that's just one part of the development process, the support process, as you were talking about, to not only recruit underrepresented faculty, but also to retain them.
Thank you, Chancellor Pembroke. And we've asked a lot of questions, but we've left out some of you need some ask the students some questions.
Mm.
So Maddie and Steve, these are for you. Is racial tension a significant part of student life at SIU, Edwardsville, or Carbondale?
I would say here, yes, at Carbondale, especially with everything that's going on right now. But as I've been here at SIU for about 10 years, and the racial tension has actually gotten a little worse, especially with the decline in African-American students here. And the lack of support from the administration to help ratify those situations and make everybody feel comfortable here. So.
Thank you, Stephen. Maddie?
Yes, I do agree that I'm only speaking from the perspective of SIUE, but I do believe that racial tension is a significant part at SIUE as well, both on campus and online as well. There have been some incidents of racial tension. I'm only a transfer student, so I've only been here a couple years, but I have a couple incidents that I did research on that happened recently that I just wanted to talk about, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so on December 2017, a racist message was found on a blackboard at SIUE that read, no person of African descent shall be a citizen of the US, nor were they ever intended to be. And that's in reference to the Dred Scott decision. It referenced the 1857 US Supreme Court decision in the Dred Scott versus F.A. Sanford case. The court ruled that Scott, a slave who was taken to free states, was then sued for his freedom, was not free because Black people were not considered citizens under the US Constitution. So that happened in 2017. So that wasn't that long ago. And then there was another incident in September of 2017 where there was a note that said, reading, filthy N-word was left on a sophomore's door. The week before that was found, officials said someone painted the Confederate flag on the rock in the quad, which is like a tradition for students. It usually, like, things don't stay up for very long, but different Greek organizations or really anyone can spray paint like on the rock, just different things, but that should not be tolerated. And then there was an incident online on the SIUE Facebook page as well that happened with one of the faculty members. Actually, there was a debate. So it was a seemingly positive post about Black Lives Matter. But then there was someone that started to comment, I'm going to say it, they were racist remarks. So examples of some of the remarks that were left by this person, which I think were later deleted, but were kept up for a long time because it was defended under the First Amendment, I believe, of free speech. He said, Blacks have been bribed to go to school today. If we did not bring Blacks over, they would still be swinging from the trees in Africa. Why don't Blacks care about thousands of Blacks killed by Blacks every year? Why don't Blacks care about slavery that still exists in other countries? And SIUE only removes direct personal attacks, despite the remark being an attack on an entire racial demographic. And then, however, other comments that were calling this said individual racist were removed. So those are some of the incidents that have happened recently. So I definitely do believe that there is racial tension on campus.
Thank you very, very much. I'm gonna go to our next question. And this goes to the president and the two chancellors. How will you make certain all system voices are heard as you work to eradicate systemic racism?
Yeah, I can start with that. I think, part of it is having these conversations so that really anybody can participate. I think as we go through, we have task forces. Randy talked about his. We have one at the system level, one at Carbondale, one at the School of Medicine, is making sure they're reaching out and connecting with more people and listening. Some of that, I usually do that by walking around campus and meeting with people and being open to having lunch and doing that type of thing. That's kind of been taken away a little bit right now. But I think continue to be committed to being able to listen to anyone. And so that, certainly when I was a president before, sitting down with all kinds of different groups, all of our staff, all of our faculty, and listening to what they have to say. I know Chancellor Lane has talked a little bit about, doing a listening tour at Carbondale. I've talked about going along with him on that tour, at least for some of it. I think some of that is also an opportunity for us to hear about issues of racism and other issues as well, but I'm sure those will come up as well. And every time I hear something, I'm always thinking about, okay, what can we do differently? What can we do better? How can this maybe be dealt with by changing in our policies, our procedures, our processes? Can we do something different to make sure that this type of situation doesn't happen again? So I think it's just being open and to continually listening to anyone. And my email, people can send me an email, president@siu.edu. I try to respond to almost everything I can as far as listening to people, whatever those comments are.
I would just echo that. It's back to action again. When we leave this conversation, and I'm so glad we're having it and that we're able to express ourselves right now, but it is back to action. And what I have found in just a very short month of me being here unofficially is that there's a lot of hurt that's still out there. And I'm glad we have the counselors on the phone or on the call, which means that there's a lot of healing that's going to have to be done. And then just basically acknowledgement. We've got to acknowledge that, we have some issues. You heard my student regent just make a comment about some of the racial tensions, and then you heard Maddie as well. We have to acknowledge that. And we have to acknowledge that we've got to do something about it, or else, again, we're just perpetuating the racial injustice. And so the action is what I'm focused on. As you heard from President Mahoney, we're going to go, when I arrive, talk to all of our faculty, staff, students, community members, you name it, anybody that will talk to us on a listening and learning tour to find out what we can do to enhance the experience of students at SIU Carbondale, and to make sure that they know that we're listening and then we're acting. And so that is, for me, going to be a high priority coming in the door as we focus on diversity and inclusion.
One of the ways that I think that you continue the conversations is that you create structure so that you have a place and a time for the conversations to continue. So two of the things that we have done just in the last, I think, 2 years at SIUE is in the fall, we have created an event called Diversity Day. And so at Diversity Day, we reflect on the diversity strategic plan for the university. We report out on areas of success, areas where we have not moved as far forward as we want, but it's a point in time where we say, how are we doing? This past year, we started something new. Several faculty members came forward, and in the fall, there is something at SIUE called the State of the University. And what we created in the spring was the state of the Black Union at SIUE. And so it specifically looks at how we're doing relating to goals, retention goals, recruiting goals, et cetera. And so those kinds of structures, I think, when they are recurring, it gives you a chance, it gives you a way to continue having the conversations that need to continue.
Oh, you're mute.
I have to apologize with everything going on with the internet. I was kicked out for a little bit. I'm back. I don't know where we are, but I do know one of the last questions was were the YouTube feed. A lot of people wanted us to follow up on Maddie's questions about what she had encountered. And so they would like, I guess, Chancellor Pembroke, would you like to respond to some of those incidents?
Okay, let me start in no particular order, and Maddie, jump in. if I don't address all of the issues. The issue about the social media posting, that was a really bad event that led to, in my mind, a good thing. And that was that we went back and revisited our social media policy. And as Maddie said, there was some conversation early in that process when the original comments went up that were around First Amendment. And those comments were balanced with discussions about our environment, our work environment, at trying to prevent a harassing, hostile work environment. So as a result of that event 2 or 3 weeks ago, we have changed our policy to where the people that manage that social website now are empowered to move much more quickly in terms of taking hurtful comments down. So I'm very pleased by that. The event that occurred in 2017, the one about the N-word being posted on the door, that also led to something that I think was a good response by the university, in that we created a bias incident response team, BIRT or BERT. And BERT is made up of several individuals across our campus. And one of the things that I like about BERT is that when we hear of an event, the members of BERT immediately reach out to a particular student that may have had a racial event occur toward them, to have it directed toward them. We immediately reach out and take care of the student, and we make sure that they're doing okay, and we make sure that they have counseling services and things, so that the first step is, what are we doing as it relates to that student? Then we also, the BERT team takes a step back and says, what do we need to do in terms of educational processes? What do we need to do in terms of training, so that we're better equipped to handle this if it were to happen again? So I think the BERT team, the evolution of the social site and how we handle that are important things. And there was one other thing that you mentioned in 2017, Maddie, another event in 2017.
Yeah, so there was, in December of 2017, there was the racist message on the blackboard in the basement. I think it was, I don't remember where it was on campus, but it was about the Dred Scott decision. So
yeah. So we did look into that, and there was less information about that, and we didn't even know for sure the context of whether that happened within a class, or exactly who the individuals were that were involved in that particular exchange. But I think the first two examples indicate that we moved forward and tried to change the way that the university handles those things. Thanks for bringing them up.
Pembroke, if that's okay.
Sure.
So you mentioned the BERT team. So what's the difference between the BERT team and the anti-racist team that you just developed recently?
The anti-racism task force, the BERT team is meant to be an ongoing group that deals, as I said, supports students, looks at specific incidents that come up on campus. So a bias incident response team. The anti-racism task force that we just created, and thank you for asking about that, is a group that is supposed to move with the fierce urgency of now, and to make specific recommendations in 4 areas: communication, recruiting and retention of students, recruiting and retention of faculty, and curricular and co-curricular experiences. So that group is more of a short-term team looking to make specific recommendations. We hope to have as many as 8 recommendations by the time we start school at the end of August, so that we can move on those very quickly in terms of changing our culture.
Todd, you're on mute again.
Sorry about that again. This is a long question. Part of confronting systemic racism will necessitate establishing new programs in certain instances and in calling for accountability for past detrimental actions by some administrators and staff. How will SIU leadership confront the potential backlash of accusations that some are receiving unjustified preferential treatment and that others are being unfairly targeted with punitive actions? I don't know who wants to start. I'll start with Chancellor Lane. You can go ahead, sir.
Yeah, could you read that again? I'm sorry, Todd.
Part of confronting systemic racism will necessitate establishing new programs in certain instances and in calling for accountability for past detrimental actions by some administrators and staff. How will SIU leadership confront the potential backlash of accusations that some are receiving unjustified preferential treatment and that others are being unfairly targeted with punitive actions?
If I hear the question correctly, just my role in coming in as a new person into an environment that for me, it's going to take some time to sift through and find out what the actual culture is. It will be important for me to have lots of conversations about who we have in place and how those individuals are performing. What their past performance has been, and then really balancing that with everything that I hear while I'm out and about and talking with the different constituency groups that are there. A big piece of what we have added within our cabinet and our leadership council is that we've shuffled a few things around. Even yourself, I think, Ty, you're going to be part of our cabinet to really talk and be a voice when it comes to diversity. We have added a few other pieces to the cabinet, and then most importantly, our constituency leads, those presidents or those leads of those groups that we need to hear from will also be a part of the leadership team or the leadership council. And so as I come in, I'll just, again, be doing a lot of listening and learning, but also checking what I expect. And I don't mean to make that sound like that's a bad thing or something to be afraid of, but everything we're talking about today, it'll be important that as we go forward and we make some of these changes, that we're able to actually see some progress as we go forward. And so I meet people where they are. And so when I get there, I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to find out if there's some things that didn't quite work the way they should have worked. Then we'll address those things in accordance with our policies and our procedures and just how we go forward administratively.
Thank you, Chancellor Pembroke.
So I would say that you should take the steps that reflect your core values. And if diversity, equity, and inclusion are important, then you need to take steps to achieve that. In looking at our numbers in terms of our staffing, as Maddie indicated, there are not a lot of faculty of color at SIUE. There are not a lot of Black faculty on our campus. If you look overall at the staffing at SIUE, about 14% of our faculty and staff are Black. If you look at the specific category of faculty, it is 5%. So in terms of your question about what are we going to do, what are we doing? We have to be more in tune in terms of the processes to hire more Black faculty to achieve diversity at our institution. One of the things that we committed to 4 years ago, actually right before I came, was the concept of a strategic hiring initiative pool. And I was disappointed that in the first 2 years that I was at SIUE, when I asked how we were doing in terms of spending the strategic hiring initiative pool, we really weren't spending a lot of that money, which to me meant that we weren't moving forward in terms of our search processes and our hires. Fortunately, in the last 2 years, we have increased faculty to where we are 11 faculty members, Black faculty members, higher compared to previous years. And I'm pleased to say that the funding in the diversity hiring initiative is actually being used. So what I'm looking forward to is that I think we will, in the next year or two, be in a position where we will recommit to that initiative and do further funding so that we can have greater diversity of our faculty at SIUE.
Thank you very, very much. I'm gonna go to a question for students again. How would you urge students to take action around systemic racism? Maddie, you can go first.
Okay, so I addressed some of the ways that students can act out in previous questions, but I have a couple things to add. So I'd urge students to take action around systemic racism by speaking up, obviously, about the injustices that they see on campus. And students can call out microaggressions such as inappropriate jokes and malicious comments as well, because that's also problematic as well. And students can also, like, I encourage them to look at the policies at the university as well as in their clubs and organizations. Are they inclusive or are they discriminatory in nature? And how can we use ways in which we can take that out and to be more inclusive to all students of various backgrounds?
Thank you very, very much. Stephen?
Hey, yes, so I would say, like Maddie said, to one, speak up if you know that there's an issue regardless to what color or race you are. Speak up and let it know that that's an issue, and also get involved in organizations that cater to the community and certain populations of students.
Thank you very, very much, Stephen. We have a question that we have for, I think it's for Dr. Lane. There's presently a video going around on social media of a current SIU student making racist statements. Some feel the university is not taking sufficient action. How would you address this claim?
Yeah, let me first start off by saying that in my month of being here, matter of fact, the first day that the board, I was being recommended and the board was approving me, we had an incident upon my confirmation. And as you can imagine, now having another one, so that's 2 within a month, that's very disheartening. Being an African-American male and having to deal with some of those hurtful messages that we've heard about already here and being discriminated against in different ways, that hurt. Just being real honest with you to see that from our students, just Salukis. And that's not the culture that we want to create here, or have folks aspire to become Salukis and represent us that way. We don't want that. Having said that, it is very important that the entire campus community understands, and I think when I get there, folks will know that I don't want to sound like a broken record, but we have due process channels that are clearly in place that have procedures tied to our student code of conduct. And I know some folks will feel like, well, you're not moving fast enough, or there is a process, just like there is out in the real world. If someone does something, it's still our job to investigate, and it's our job to make sure once we investigate that we act within the structure and the policies that are already established. And for students, that's the student code of conduct. And so I want to make sure that everyone is aware of that conduct or that procedural document, because it will really give you a clear indication on how not only SIUC, but institutions as a whole move forward when they get allegations. Keyword is allegations that come in that show or that tells the community, in a sense, how we're going to act. I don't condone any of the language that I have witnessed in those videos. I've actually personally reached out to one of the students in question and had a conversation with him, and Todd, I know you have as well, so we can then educate our students or past students about, really how we want to portray or how we want our community to be. But it's been rough. Even today, we've had a lot of conversations about the incident that's out there. So I want everyone to know that, going forward, it's going to be very important that everyone knows that we're going to aggressively investigate. We're going to aggressively act on things that are counter to what we want our culture to be, because that impacts enrollment. That impacts whether mom and dad want to send their son or daughter to SIU Carbondale. And if you know about enrollment, that means dollars in some cases. And I don't want to make it sound like we're all about the money here, but we are an institution that is trying to recruit a diverse group of students to our institution and turn them out into the workplace. And so we can have alums that are proud to be Salukis. And so that would be my goal in being there or getting there, is that for those that may think we're not moving fast enough, we apologize, but we're moving. And we are going to address those things that are, again, counter to the culture that we're trying to create.
Thank you, Chancellor Lane. Question from the audience. Both SIUC and SIUE have participated in numerous performative allyship actions and ignored how they uphold white supremacy in every aspect of higher education. What makes this time different for SIU? Whoever can go first.
I'll start. I think I don't know exactly what the person's referring to, so I can't speak to that. I think, what is the difference? And I tried to outline this in the note I sent a couple of weeks ago. What we're trying to do is, again, we have a task force at the system level. We have a task force at each campus. They are coming up with actionable plans. I think you heard it from Chancellor Pembroke, Chancellor Wayne. You'll hear it from me over and over again. We need to be developing kind of assessments. So we're constantly evaluating how well we're doing. And that's not just number assessments, but that's certainly part of it. But we're holding people accountable. We need to have a culture of accountability. And this needs to be part of what we do all of the time. And it can't just be, again, we do a couple of things at this moment, and then we move on. It has to be something that's living documents that we are constantly assessing ourselves against. And we are, and really those documents may be changing and evolving as we find out more information. So as we kind of find, and I think Chancellor Pembroke gave a couple of good examples, we find maybe our processes and procedures aren't what they need to be, or we need to come up with a different policy to deal with something, then we adjust it going forward. But we need to have, again, some clear accountability for everyone in the system. If this is what our value is, I know it's what my values are. I also know it's what the board's values are. And I can't tell you how important it is to have a board of trustees that is supportive of the things I've been saying over the last month. We've been supportive of all the notes I've sent out of really tackling systemic racism. That makes a big difference. When it's through the whole system, when you have the people at the top, you have the presidents, you have the chancellors, you have the dean of medicine, you have all of those people all kind of working together, I think that's how you have a real lasting change.
Thank you very, very much. Our next question says, SIUC athletics banned taking the knee to put forward a message of unity just a few years ago. How are you planning to address this going forward? Also, the ladies who protested deserve apologies. I'm just reading the question. Also, the ladies who protested deserve your apologies. I don't think Dr. Mahoney or Chancellor Lane were here at that time. There were, I would say there was some cheerleaders who took a knee during the national anthem. There was a situation that happened in athletics. I don't remember exactly what happened, but I know when the former athletic director came in, he said students are allowed to protest. And we had a few protests, and there was some backlash to that as well. We had to have police around them. I guess the question is asking, would you allow that? Will you allow the freedom of expression from our students this year?
I can answer that, Todd. I've read a lot about that particular case or that event. To give you a quick answer, yes. I mean, we're an educational institution that is supposed to be about a place where students can express themselves without repercussions if it's not disruptive to the academic environment. And what the young ladies, I think, displayed was not disruptive. It was them expressing their right to be able to. I think they were kneeling or doing. I think that was the gist of what that was way back a couple of years ago. It's important that we don't take that right away from students. The only time that you'll ever see me do anything to insert myself is when, again, if there's any disruption, which this wasn't, but if there's a disruption to the academic environment, to the learning, or to the safety of other students, faculty, or staff, that's really the only time that we ever insert or get involved. And so I applaud the young ladies who took that particular stance. It was their right to do so. And I know in athletics, with our athletic director, our new athletic director, Liz is already hitting the ground running and doing a really good job in making sure that inside of our athletic department, that students are able to express themselves. The student athletes know that we do support them 100% in what they're doing. And so I think going forward, I'm excited about being there and again, being on the ground to talk to more students about some of the things that they'd like to express.
So
Thank you, Chancellor.
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
Todd. One of the things that I appreciated during the last year or two, the national debate about whether to take a knee or not during the national anthem, was that on our campus, that was a moment where dialogue occurred on each of the teams as they talked about what that meant, why that was important, and how the teams felt that they should respond. And so it wasn't an approach that was mandated. It wasn't an approach that was disqualified or negated in any way. It was a conversation that each team had, and different teams responded in different ways. And I thought, within the context of what we're talking about here tonight, about how to have those conversations, I thought it was a really interesting and educational way, I think, for the members of those teams to address that issue.
Thank you, Chancellor Pembroke. We have about 18 more minutes before we stop the question and answer session, and we'll start with our counselors. But we have one other question. What changes will be made to the core curriculum to address systemic racism? Chancellor Pembroke, would you like to start?
I would love to start on that one because I have a very short and I hope to the point answer. That is why we have the task force going, and committee number 3, subcommittee number 3 of the task force. The question you just asked is the same question that I ask of them. And I'm expecting them to have at least 2 curriculum recommendations by August 24th when we start school.
Well, thank you. Chancellor Lane, I know you haven't started yet, but you want to answer that question?
Ditto. Yeah, I'll just say ditto.
Okay, thank you.
Exactly, yeah, just ditto.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna follow up with that question. Maddie and Stephen, The diversity classes that you took your first year or when you transitioned to SIU, Edwardsville and Carbondale, were they sufficient enough, or should you have taken more classes, or should students take more classes when they come to the campus?
So my situation is a little unique, being a transfer student from a community college that was a little bit more diverse. But I'm also a sociology minor. So I've had a lot of courses in race and ethnic relations and a lot of courses dealing kind of with what we're dealing with currently. So my experience is different. And so I'm not aware, but I don't think that freshmen have to take any type of like courses in sociology, or I don't think like the criminal justice system at SIUE has to. I really think that that's important, that we need to take more classes like that. And then, like I mentioned earlier, I think that, you know, how we have the not anymore, I think that we should have some other like equivalent training for that that's required to graduate or to continue on. So.
Thank you, Maddie. Stephen?
Excuse me. Yes, I would say that, how can I put this? Through my coursework, like Maddie said, like through my program, I learned a lot about cultural diversity and, you know, how to address your own biases. But as an incoming freshman, I can't say that that was a topic that was made important.
Do you feel that's important that every student should take in their freshman year?
Yes, just it kind of gives them a little foundation, especially at a diverse campus.
All right, thank you, Maddie.
I was also just going to say that taking these classes like provides us to have this type of dialogue that we wouldn't otherwise have. So I think that it's important for freshmen and transfer students alike to be on that same level and to take these types of classes.
All right, thank you very, very much. I'm looking at another question. What accountability measures are you putting in place to ensure system and university administration will be held accountable to equity, inclusion, and diversity efforts so it's not performative?
You want me to start with that one? I think
Go ahead,
that's what, again, much like we talked about the curriculum, I think those are some of the things we're working on right now to determine what those accountability measures will be. I can tell you some things we've done other places I have been, and that may be at least helpful to think about. For example, as we were doing recruiting a faculty when I was at Kent State, I had everybody do a recruitment plan. And part of that plan had to be focused on how they were going to try to recruit a diverse pool of candidates. And when they would bring me the pool of candidates at the end and say, these are our 3 finalists, and particularly when there was no diversity, my question was, did you follow the plan that we agreed on at the beginning? And if they didn't, we had to go back and they had to go back to the search again. So that was one of the ways I held them accountable of, you need to develop a plan. It needs to be a plan we both agree on. And if you don't follow the plan, then I'm not going to support hiring the people when you didn't do what you said you were going to do. And that was just one way of holding people accountable. I think, again, looking at scorecards and some data and saying, okay, here you have an issue here, whether it's a lack of diversity among faculty or students, what are you doing about it? Developing plans again, and do they follow through with it? Is there actual changes there? And if it's not, then we need to work on what needs to be different. And at some point, people cannot, again, affect any change, then we need to move on to a leader that really will embrace those values and the culture and the what we're trying to do going forward. So I think there's multiple things involved with kind of creating that culture of accountability, but it needs to be a part of our assessment of administrators at every level.
And for us, we're going to be embarking upon our new strategic plan, SIUC in 2030. And as we, again, have these conversations, we start to prioritize or have our top priorities. And if these priorities come out, which I think they will, especially after all these discussions about, you know, how do we hold ourselves accountable to these items that we hold so dear to our hearts, the accountability is going to come in then how we monitor and measure and assess our effectiveness. And that's in everyone, you know, doing their job to make sure that we're trying to hit that target. So I think we'll have a lot of work to do in the midst of everything else that's going on in this fall and spring, and trying to you know, again, prioritize and to lay the foundation for our strategic plan going forward 10 years. But It's good work to do, so we don't miss the mark on things that we're trying to get accomplished.
Thank you, Chancellor Lane.
I would just come back to what I said previously about Diversity Day. October 15, 16, if you want to mark it on your calendar. Diversity Day, one of the reasons why I wanted to create that at SIUE is so that we had a specific point in time where we would pause and we would ask ourselves the questions that we're bringing up right now. What are our goals? How did we do on those goals in the last year? And how do we feel about that? And so that, I think, is an indicator of key performance indicators of what we're trying to accomplish and are we getting there. And one of the things I really like about the diversity strategic plan that we have is that we divided the work among lots of people so that there are stakeholders and there are people that are responsible for certain goals. So not only do we talk about how we're doing, but we say to individuals, would you like to present on your goal? So it kind of reminds us and holds us all accountable, including I've got 2 or 3 in there myself. So.
Thank you, Chancellor Pembroke.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. It says, because Southern Illinois was the home of one of the oldest Native cultures in what is now the U.S., and because Native people have a long and deep-rooted history throughout this region, will there be efforts to also recruit, support, and mentor significant numbers of Native Indigenous students, faculty, and staff?
I don't know if you want Pete to address that one.
Well, you should probably go first, because after we're done with this, you're going to start again. So
Okay, that's fine. But let me start. Yes, and I think when we're talking about dealing with anti-racism, sometimes we focus on African Americans only, but there's multiple populations that have experienced racism in the United States. There's Native Americans, Latinx population, many others, Asian Americans who've dealt with it. It's not just one group that we're focused on. And often that's a group, when you talk about Native Americans, who in higher education, we frankly have ignored, and I think not done a sufficient job of recruiting into either as students or into the academy as faculty and administrators, and need to do a much better job. So yeah, that is certainly part of it in my mind.
thank you. Would anybody else like to answer that question? Okay, there's a follow-up to the previous question. How are you going to include literature, resources, books, research by people of color in the core curriculum?
I think at SIUC, one of the biggest things that I'll have to find out is my faculty and staff and students educate me on what's there now is what are we doing now? And that's really kind of the gist of the conversation. What are we doing now, and what do we want to do in the future, given all that we know in terms of issues that are out there surrounding race? And so I'll rely heavily on our faculty, particularly as it relates to literature and as it relates to research that's out there. I know we have faculty that are doing that already. Some of our very own faculty have done a tremendous job. Is there an opportunity to highlight their research to help us moving forward in some of these areas that we're going to tackle? But we do it collectively. And so just finding out and uncovering what exists today and then how we're going to be able to collectively do it together going forward is going to be the key on whatever gets implemented.
So if I could jump in and respond to that, one of the things that we challenged the curriculum committee, subcommittee to do of the task force was to not simply think of this conversation as being one class. I think sometimes we create a class and then we say, well, so we created a class, so we've dealt with the issue and we've taken care of it. What we did for the subcommittee number 3 curriculum group was to ask the question, what experiences should happen when a student first arrives at SIUE The second question was what should happen throughout the freshman year. And then the third question, which I think is just as important, is what are the ways that conversations about race will occur for that student as they continue throughout their major. So what are the things that need to be addressed within certain disciplines, within certain academic areas, and where are those conversations happening in years 2, 3, and 4? So I don't know if everybody would agree with that, but I think that the curricular conversation needs to be broader than thinking about one particular class on literature or one particular class on the arts. It frequently is addressed that way, but I think we can do better.
Thank you, Chancellor Pembroke. We have about 7 minutes before we go to Dr. Brody and Dr. Clark. I would like to hear from the students. Would you like to say anything before we close? And because you are a special part of this, and we want to make sure that we hear from you more today.
I just want to say thank you to Jacob for inviting me to sit in as trustee. I'm honored to be able to do this and to meet all you guys and to have this type of conversation. And I don't know if you can tell when I start speaking, I'm really passionate about diversity. So I'm just really happy that I could be here and that I was able to get some more dialogue and maybe people having side conversations afterward, or just, you know, thinking more deeply about how they can be actively anti-racist and, you know, just questioning their implicit biases and working towards being a better person.
Thank you, Maddie. Stephen?
Yeah, I also want to say I'm just grateful for this opportunity. What we're dealing with race is a big issue now. So for the leadership role that I have, I feel like it's very important for me to not only be a part of the conversations, but listen, give feedback, and become more knowledgeable and with working with others.
Thank you, Stephen. Dr. Bodie, you're up next. We're coming to you a little bit sooner than what I expected. Are you ready to go? There you go. Dr. Bodie.
Thanks, Todd. I'll begin my brief remarks by offering a bit of context. So the systemic anti-Black racism at the center of today's conversation is an artifact of the very founding of this country. Land was taken from its indigenous residents, and a combination of those humans and enslaved Africans was used to fuel the US economy. Even when this inconvenient truth is acknowledged, what is often missing is the link between past and present. More specifically, the ways in which these brutal events, coupled with centuries of policies intended to oppress Black folks, is hidden, or at least attempts are made to hide it. Every day, descendants of the enslaved navigate minority stress woven into the very fabric of our collective reality. It rears its ugly head in multiple ways from the moment that Black folks leave their homes. It may look like the potential for negative encounters with law enforcement, the ways in which people are looked at as though they don't belong in the parking lot of the institutions to which they are employed. It shows up by watching the physical distance that exists between Black folks and others way before COVID-19 entered our lives, to the ways in which people inappropriately comment on the way we wear our hair, the scents that we wear, the garments that we use to adorn our bodies, to the volume level at which we speak, to the ways in which evaluations and even opportunities for upward mobility look. Everyday life is infused with threats that seek to undermine our acumen, confidence, approach to living, and basic humanity. These sometimes subtle and sometimes not experiences are remnants of our country's tendency to revise its past and attempt to erase its marginalized. What I'm describing is cultural trauma, an underexplored yet wildly rampant phenomenon that has the capacity to leach satisfaction with living and opportunities to flourish and thrive. Remember, it's racism, not race, that's the social determinant of health underlying many of the disparities that we see that exist between Black Americans and many of their counterparts who exist from other racial groups. This, however, doesn't have to be the case. So I'll focus a little bit on feelings. Humans have evolved to possess a remarkable affective system which enables us to connect with the world around us, understand it, and act in ways that promote our survival. For minoritized people, specifically Black Americans, 400 years of pain has been stifled by deeming the ways in which people respond to be either aggressive or unprofessional, not acceptable. Ask yourself this: what happens to absolutely anyone or anything that's suppressed? It explodes. This helps to explain the need that many have had to take to the streets to remind ourselves and others that even in the throes of racism as a system, we do indeed exist, and we do have a full measure of humanity. As scary as it can be at times, our bodies are wonderful mechanisms for noting affect. Our heart rates may increase, our palms may become clammy, a sensation of heat may rise up from the chest to our head, our stomach may feel uncomfortable. All of these represent ways in which our bodies have taken in information from the outside, categorized it, and are seeking to mobilize a specific set of actions. So one of the things that I think is a huge disservice in the way that our education system functions is that people rarely learn about the body that we have and how that affective or emotional or feelings-based system works. So I'm going to review just a little bit of that. Whenever you have emotions, they're intended to direct a specific type of energy toward a specific type of action. So when we experience anxiety, which is what I was describing before, that's that battle emotion that's used to help us discern when there are threats potentially on the horizon. Depression, as nasty as it may feel, is the retreat emotion that helps us to withdraw from hopeless situations. Frustration, or the protest emotion, helps us to express discontent and to compel others to alter their behavior. Guilt helps us to maintain our relationships and to increase our relational obligations, which is why we generally feel it in our stomach and it feels a little bit like revulsion or disgust. Same sort of evolutionary function. Anger is the obstacle emotion that lets us know there's actually a barrier in place that needs to move aside. But that's another one of those reasons why its fuse is really short. And sadness. Sadness is one of those loss emotions. So if you think about emotions as the ways in which we communicate outside of ourselves in order sometimes to elicit feedback, the tears and the sadness and those sorts of things can help us connect to others in the moment just when we've seemed to have lost quite a bit. Feel your feelings. In many ways, they are our guide, helping us to determine what's next. When applied to personal health, they often can illuminate what we need in order to move forward. Sometimes it's connection. At other times, it's movement, like literal physiological movement. Still at other times, it's the type of structural change that we've gathered here today to discuss, a type of second order removal of intentionally erected life barriers. Notice and experience, you deserve it. In the words of the students, period. Dr. Clark will now share her remarks.
I want to start off by thanking Dr. Bodie for laying the groundwork for some of the emotions that I'm going to talk about, but also just wanted to thank all of you for tonight. This is really encouraging to have all of these leaders here tonight and make this possible. The students, I want to thank you especially for facing some of the power differentials even in this room and in this conversation to bring a voice to our SIU students. And to all of those spectators out there who are a part of this conversation. I think SIU has become stronger tonight because we're starting this series of conversations. My role tonight is to discuss how we can engage in these difficult dialogues in ways to support mental health while transforming our passion and emotion into action. So Dr. Bodie talked a lot about these emotions, and I want to talk about some of how we can transform this into action. I acknowledge with you first and foremost that I have some privileged identities. I'm sitting here speaking from a place of privilege, like Dr. Mahoney talked about. So I've been sheltered from some of the systemic racism that's been talked about tonight. But I'm also coming to you like the students as a person, as part of your SIU family that wants change and wants action. And I think from hearing some of the examples that the students shared, and also what Dr. Lane shared about his first month here on the job, I think that this is an important conversation where we need to start. A great leader once said, hate has caused a lot of problems in this world, but has not solved one yet. When there is hate and when some of these things that are being expressed are present, some of the strong emotions come up that Dr. Bodie was talking about. These emotions are strong and these emotions are valid. And I think that we all need to accept that part. But the questions posed to us tonight are, how do we tolerate these emotions more effectively? How do we have these conversations like we're having tonight skillfully? And how do we create social change together? First and foremost, we need to recognize that we're not alone in this. You need to surround yourself with people that are positive social supports for you. This can be especially important when we're dealing with a national pandemic, where systematic healthcare disparities are really relevant right now. And social distancing is the recommended response. I'm going to ask you tonight to redefine social distancing to being physical distancing. We need to have physical distance to help not spread COVID-19, but we don't need social distance. What we need is social unity and social support. The last thing that leads to strong mental health is a lack of social support. What we all need is to find ways to get support from the people that are in similar stages of social action. And that's okay, whatever stage that you're in. We all have different comfort levels with how we approach social action. But you need to spend time with more supportive friends, family, professors, mentors, and this can be a really effective way to release stress and reduce isolation. If you're unsure where to start, SIU has many places to go. You have your multicultural resource centers. There are student RSOs, community organizations, and you can come to counseling for a confidential place to come. When people talk about social support and positive social support, we often leave out boundaries and limiting people that aren't positive social supports. And so I want to make sure that we highlight that as well. It is important to remember that building these social supports means decreasing the amount of time that you spend with people that aren't supports to you, that don't value you and respect your values and respect the identities that you have. Sometimes that means not looking at social media for hours on end and looking at the social posts that can be hurtful. Sometimes we need a break from that. Second, we need to look at dealing with the pressures of being exposed to racism and discrimination, especially during a national pandemic. We can lose track of how to take care of ourselves. Right now, alcohol and drug use is on the rise, abuse is on the rise, isolation's on the rise, suicide is on the rise. So it's a very important time that we start with self-compassion, that we build in and learn and discuss ways to build in the positive coping strategies, and that you give yourself permission to function at a little bit lower capacity. I know for sure that I am. It's important to recognize that while we're all wired, as Dr. Bodie talked about, to feel fear and anxiety, especially in these times of uncertainty, that can also lead us to cascade into catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, and responding purely out of emotions. During times of uncertainty, it's very imperative that we focus on what's in our personal control. So when we think about these actions and these dialogues, we need to think about creating routines for ourselves, building structure for ourselves, and building in the self-care techniques that allow us to have conversations that are balanced with both our passion and emotions and giving ourselves access to the resources we need to do this effectively. Take a walk, get fresh air, hang out with a friend. We need to eat nutritious meals, get balanced sleep, and build in activities of things that you enjoy into your daily lives. Now to the tougher part. How do we have these dialogues? How do we get empowered? How do we find our voice to take action? If you're experiencing racism or discrimination, or you consider yourself an ally to someone who is, finding an effective way to advocate for yourself or for those other people is empowering and it is healthy. Finding your own voice and engaging in social action can reduce feelings of depression and helplessness, and it can be a really positive outlet for your frustration and your anger. But it's important that we respond in a manner that's intentional. At times, when we're responding purely out of emotion, we don't have access to the things that will help us actually make change. So sometimes we have to sit back and reflect and have access to those emotions while we also have access to our planning and our reasoning skills so that we can be really intentional with the steps that we want to take and be most effective in targeting the change that we'd like to see. Empowerment may look different for different people in different situations. One person's first step might be confronting, maybe even in a light-mannered way, a group of friends that made, a hurtful or offensive statement. Whereas others might be more able to engage in political or activist action, become a part of a protest, maybe even organize something. Regardless of whatever stage you're in, it's going to be best if you have a support system around you, if you can do that as a team, and that you work through a common cause. You want to be clear about your goals going in. What do you want to accomplish from the action? How are you going to accomplish this? And what changes do you want to see implemented? In this, we have to think of a couple things. What is my timing? Who is my audience? Are we actually having our voices heard to an audience that can make some change? I'd say the students did a good job of showing us that tonight. Talking to the leaders, talking to the presidents and the chancellors and saying, this is what the students want. This is what my experience is. That's a good audience. We need to figure out who our audience is to make change. During these recent protests, a lot of our staff have been receiving questions about what does it mean to be an effective ally? And being an ally is certainly part of social justice and social change. Many of us sit here, like me, in a position of privilege, but we also are firmly committed to advocating for students of color on the SIU campus. Allies are important partners in combating racism and discrimination on campus. For those of you that have joined this campus and are listening in tonight because you want to become an effective ally, I will share with you the following strategies. Number one, make an effort to learn the history and current issues relative to the communities you support. Too often, people of color are left holding the responsibility for educating others and speaking up about racism. But racism is everyone's issue. It's all of our issue. It's our job to hear and listen and become educated to make those changes. It's all of us. Second, it's important for allies to speak up when you witness racism. However, it's very important that when you speak up, that you only speak for yourself. Speaking for others can be inaccurate and even unintentionally perceived as condescending or offensive. I know this as a counselor. As a psychologist, I often think that because I've heard multiple people's stories of racism and oppression, that maybe I know someone else's experience. I've had to step back and challenge that. Everybody's experience is different, so speak to your own experience. Third, know the difference between someone's intent and impact. It's easy to recognize overt racism, but it's harder to address racism when it comes without malicious intent. In these moments, challenging that behavior that the person's engaging in and not the person or the character of the person, and generalizing it out can really help people realize that their actions were hurtful when you approach them in a way that they can hear it versus a way that involves name calling or an escalation or hostility. And finally, in order to get it right, we all need to be willing to make mistakes. I can tell you that I've made a lot of mistakes in my journey, and I'm going to continue to make a lot more. From time to time, we're going to hurt people that we don't want to hurt. We're going to hurt the exact people that we want to support. But a willingness to genuinely listen, engage, and apologize when it's necessary is how we can also be genuine in this path. Don't say, I'm sorry you're hurt. Say something more intentional like, I'm sorry that the action or the words that I just said caused you pain. That accountability can help us move forward and also engage in ways to stop that from happening again. So when we talk about our own education, our own learning, learn from that. When you step in it, so to speak, and you hurt somebody, learn from that, generalize that out. Don't make the same mistakes, but continue learning. In the words of the great Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. I think that's really important that when we make mistakes, that people will still remember that you cared enough to make the corrections and make it right. She also said, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget the way that you made them feel. And I think that's what we want to leave here knowing, is that we want people to feel heard, we want people to feel empowered. Social change can take time. Like Maddie and Stephen both talked about, be persistent with this. Black lives matter then, they matter now, they're going to matter in the future. Be persistent with whatever social action it is that you have. Change can be slow, and social movements are a really slow, long process, but don't underestimate your ability to be a part of that change. We all can be a part of that change. University campuses have long been places that make change and are very powerful in starting social movements. In closing, I just want to say that we recognize the relentless impact that prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination have had on mental health and well-being. And we are here to support you in any way that we can. Our staff feels and understands the many reactions that can ensue from these events, such as fear, anger, the anxiety that Dr. Bodie talked about, and grief and loss for the experiences. At SIU, we can join you in processing how systems of oppression and traumatic events impact your feelings, beliefs, and identities. And we can also try to connect you with resources that make you feel safer and resonate with you. Thank you for all of you partaking in this with us.
Thank you, Dr. Clark, Dr. Bodie. Excuse me. President Mahoney, we will end with you. You have 7 to 8 minutes, or you can go longer if you want to, because you're the president. So go ahead.
I'll try to keep it within the time frame. I don't want to take up more people's time. First of all, thanks again for everybody for joining us today. We do appreciate this. Obviously, to have a conversation. We could have a good conversation with the whatever it is, 12 of us here, but it's a lot richer conversation to have all of you engaged, listening and asking us questions. So we appreciate that. Appreciate the panelists, moderator, everybody really involved with helping to do this tonight. We appreciate your work. I do want to thank also the Diversity Advisory Council, who, when I kind of came to them and said, I would like to do something, I really left it up to them to develop the way we would do it, who we would include. And they've done a really nice job of planning this out, and we'll continue to plan these. I do want to say again, this is the first of conversations that we'll have going forward, and what role I'll play in the future, I'll kind of leave up to them to decide. I don't have to be part of it every time, but I want to be at least listening to it every time. And our next one will be in August. We'll pick a date sometime later, but one of the things I would ask all of you to do who are listening is what should be our next topic? Today we focused on systemic racism. What should be the next topic? We're open to hearing what those might be. Again, you can send an email to me at president@siu.edu, and we'll make sure we get that to the Diversity Advisory Council, and we'll come up with a good topic going forward. I want to leave you just a couple quick thoughts. One is whenever I think about this, and I did get one of these responses recently to I think an article I did or an interview I did with the newspaper of, this really isn't that big of an issue. This is not what you should be focused on. And the thing I always think about is if someone came from a different planet and came down and looked at what we were doing in higher education, looked at the numbers of students, numbers of faculty, they looked at our curriculum, they looked at everything, would they think we were really truly being equitable? Or would they see that we could do better? And I can almost guarantee someone objectively looking who had never seen any of this, doesn't know anything, would say, you have some issues and you need to do better. There's a lot that we want to do. It's everything from looking at, and you'll hear me talk a lot about processes. I think a lot of it comes down to having better policies, procedures, better processes for doing things. And again, whether it's searching for faculty, better ways of retaining and programs to support faculty, and staff retention. It's recruiting students, how we recruit students, how we distribute scholarship aid, how we develop our curriculum. And I loved what was said by some people here today. I think Randy's point was a really great one. It's not just one class. We're letting everybody off the hook if we say, well, you got one class, now you're done. Almost any class I've ever taught, issues of race and gender have been part of them because they are part of it. And we need to be thinking about that in all that we do. And that really gets me to the point that we all can play a part, and our part may be different. And sometimes that part is changing what we're doing in our own classes, changing what we do in our roles as staff, changing what we're doing as students and what we're trying to learn and things that we're opening to, whether it's attending a seminar or attending a session, of being open to more things. There's a lot we all can do. We can all think about the things we say, and I think Dr. Clark on this, the things we may do that unintentionally hurt people. I had a faculty colleague from a previous institution recently talk about how people kept referring to her as a diversity hire. That was hurtful. She says, I'm a diverse hire, not a diversity hire. And that subtle change in wording means a world of difference. We didn't hire her because of the color of her skin. She was highly qualified. She deserved to have that role. She is a diverse faculty member, so she's a diverse hire, but she was not a diversity hire. And how we use language sometimes can really affect people, and being open into listening to people when they say, what you said hurt me, and not being defensive and being willing to learn from that. And that's, I guess, the next thing I would say is that we're all learning. I think Dr. Clark mentioned that as well. You know, I know things I've said in the past or done in the past. It's like I've learned from them. I've listened to colleagues and tried to be more clear about things and try to listen better. I think that's something we can all do. So again, no matter what role you have at the university, whether you're a faculty, staff, or student, there is something you can do to help us move forward and become a better institution and really deal with some of the systemic racism. That's not just true at SIU. This is not our problem alone. This exists across higher ed. It exists across every institution I have been at. This is not a unique problem of our own. But let me be clear, we have an aspiration. We want to do better. We want to be the model. We want to be the place that everybody else looks at as a place that have really addressed some of the issues of systemic racism, took some real action, made some real change, and really becomes a model for everybody else across the higher education landscape and really across the Southern Illinois area as well. So we have big aspirations, and we'll hope you'll join us and be a part of this as we go forward. So thank you.
Thank you, President Mahoney. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. As Dr. Mahoney said, we will have another one of these in August. We will let you know when that is. Please submit your comments about our next topic, and thank you, and have a very, very good week, a good holiday week. Thank you.